We have sound. Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in MacEachen, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people, and I encourage us at the beginning of African Heritage Month to reflect on the ways, particularly that we as people of African descent can work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here in Mi'kmaq and indeed across the many territories and nations within what we currently call Canada. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this evening's event. My name's Cherie Dryden, and I am the co-organizer for our panel event this evening, along with Keisha Jeffries. Now, Keisha, unfortunately, is unable to make it today, but she does send her regards, and I'm sure she's looking at us on the live stream. So, hi, Keisha. So as junior fellows at the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance, we're responsible for contributing to the research goals and learning culture of the Institute. And so we achieve this by working with the Institute to support the development of progressive public policy and encourage citizen engagement. So for us, what we thought of was the Countess in document when we both reflected on that particular clause of the MacEachen Institute's kind of mission statement. We conceptualized of this panel early in the fall of 2019, after recognizing gaps at the intersection of public discourse, policy, and academia on topics that are pertinent, policy topics that are pertinent to people of African descent. As students who are committed to our studies, which inevitably includes social justice, health equity, and policy, we believed that a conversation surrounding the Countess report was crucial. So just to give you a bit of context behind the report, it's called Countess in Nova Scotia's Action Plan in response to the International Decade for People of African Descent. And it's designed to provide the provincial government with specific actions, strategic priorities, and criteria to reduce and eventually eliminate the countless challenges that systematically oppress African Nova Scotians and people of African descent in this province. So the goals of Countess in are to provide a framework for government to address the issues and concerns that oppress African Nova Scotians and people of African descent, to work towards advancing social justice, inclusion policies, eradicating structural racism, and promoting human rights, and to create partnerships and opportunities between people of African descent, the community, and government to address inequalities in all facets of our society. And so we encourage everyone to visit the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs website and download the report and see it for yourself. And so just very quickly, before I turn over remarks to our chair for the evening, I just want to thank, firstly, all of you for joining us this evening. I want to thank particularly Dr. Cherie Dryden for being the moderator for our event, and I'll introduce her shortly. I'd like to extend an additional thank you to the MacEachen Institute, of course, for supporting and for putting on this panel, the Dalhousie President's Office and Student Affairs for providing financial resources to make this event possible, and to the Health Association of African Canadians and the community of Black students in nursing for also supporting us in this endeavor. So the format for tonight's session will be a moderated panel discussion, and we've divided the discussion into three sections which mirror the three core pillars in the Countess in report: recognition, justice, and development. And so we've developed a series of questions that will be posed to the panelists by our wonderful chair from each of the three sections. And so following the discussion, there'll be about 25 minutes for audience questions, and I'll leave it to the chair to kind of help to frame that discussion. And one final thing, this event will conclude at 6:30 p.m., at which point we invite you to join us at another exciting event hosted by the Black Students Advising Center. And so that event is called The Power of Believing in Yourself, Reflections of a Rocket Scientist, and it'll feature entertainment, refreshments, and a presentation by Dr. Renee Horton, and that's going to be just over the road on the second floor of the Student Union building in the McInnes room. We do have feedback forms on the table outside, so when you do leave the session, if you wouldn't mind giving us your feedback about what you thought about tonight, that'd be great. So, now enough from me. I'm going to introduce our chair and our panelists, and then I will let our chair take it away. So firstly, Dr. Cherie Dryden is the James R. Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine and Associate Professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology. Dr. Dryden is an interdisciplinary scholar whose scholarship and research is situated in Black Canadian thought, specifically Black queer diasporic analytics. She is a researcher in residence and a member of the African, Caribbean, and Black Program's Science Scholars Lab at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. Dr. Dryden is also a member of the Black Feminist Health Science Studies International Research Group. And Dr. Dryden is the co-editor of Disrupting Queer Inclusion, Canadian Homo-Nationalisms and the Politics of Belonging, and has published a number of peer-reviewed papers. So please join me in giving a hand to Dr. Dryden. Next, we have, so to quickly introduce the panelists, we have Wayn Hamilton. So Wayn was born in Beachville, Nova Scotia. Shout out Beachville. A small Black community on the outskirts of Metro Halifax. He attended Dalhousie University and received a Bachelor of Arts in African Studies and a Bachelor of Education degree with a major in Language Arts. Wayn also has a Master's in Planning and Development from the University of Guelph, and he was a youth councillor for the YMCA's Job Generation Project and the past director of the International Education Centre at St. Mary's University. Wayn has spent more than 15 years working and living in Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, has traveled to many West African countries. In November 2003, Wayn was seconded to the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs to develop the framework and strategic plan for the office, and he is now currently the Executive Director of African Nova Scotian Affairs. Could you please join me in giving a hand to...
Yay! Beautiful.
Next, we have Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, an educator, journalist, and a community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. In 2016, Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She's a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. And along with this work, she supports women in Nova Institution in writing and sharing their voices. Elle was named the Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University for the 2017-19 term. Her book of spoken word poetry, Live from the African Resistance, was published by Roseway Press in 2014. Next, we have Crystal Watson. So Crystal has spent the last 20 plus years in the recreation field, working with individuals from various backgrounds. She attended St. Mary's University for a psychology undergraduate degree, before heading to Dalhousie for her bachelor degree in therapeutic recreation, followed by a Master of Arts degree in leisure studies. She practiced as a recreation therapist for 10 years in the areas of transitional care, physical medicine, and rehabilitation in neurosurgery and in junior high schools. She began teaching at Dalhousie as a sessional instructor, in which she then developed an interest in post-secondary education. And prior to her current role as Executive Director of Recreation Nova Scotia, she was the lead core faculty at the Nova Scotia Community College, teaching the Therapeutic Recreation Diploma program, where she completed a full program curriculum revision. She is currently enrolled in doctoral studies at Dalhousie, pursuing her research interest in understanding the play experiences of African Nova Scotian children.
Doctor, to me.
And our final panelist is Lyndale Smith. So Lyndale Smith is a lifelong resident of North End, Halifax, and the proud father of a beautiful daughter. Co-founder of Centerline Studio, a non-profit recording studio for youth who want to express themselves through art and music, Lindell is also a member of the One North End project, made up of community leaders from around HRM, whose aim is to ensure that all residents benefit from the rapid growth by encouraging new hiring practices for local businesses and holding community engagement sessions. In 2016, Lindell was elected City Councillor for District 8, Halifax Peninsula North. And with that, I'll hand over to our chair.
Thank you. Can I be heard? Yes, no? Is working, not working? A little louder, okay. How about that? Good. Oh, there we are. So I guess I just assume all mics are live, so, which is really a good assumption we should always make. Good evening, how are you? I'm great, thank you. Happy African History Month. Make sure that you do your calisthenics and your stretching, because there are a lot of events this month, and you will be out at all of them. So before I get started, we're talking about this report and this direction, Count Us In, that focuses on African Nova Scotian communities, since we are in an African Nova Scotian space. And so I just want to add to the land acknowledgement that was said before and that we say in lots of places. And I want to add to it because if we really are connected and committed to a decolonial and anti-colonial practice, then it becomes incumbent upon us to also acknowledge how anti-Black slavery, how anti-Black racism is the cornerstone of colonialism, is one of the cornerstones of colonialism. Canada, like the United States and many countries in the Caribbean, was founded through colonialism and slavery. And so this past August in 2019 marked the 400th year of the transatlantic slave trade. We're not that far from it, while we're far from it. And so for us to be committed truly to a decolonial practice, it means that we also need to be committed to having those conversations around anti-Black racism. And they can be difficult, but in order for us to really decolonize our systems and our relationships, then it means we are required to have that conversation around anti-Black racism. Right? So let's start including that, not only through this month, but in our other engagements around land acknowledgements. And again, just a quick shout out, let's remember that Black people are not settlers, right? As arrivants through this violent practice of slavery, we can't simply create categories of settlers and indigenous, right? We need to think in a more complicated way. So, with that in mind, and the wonderful welcome from Tari, and the wonderful work that Tari and Keisha have put on, let's get started. So the first question, so as Tari said, I'm going to ask a question. Everyone's going to get a chance to ruminate on it and speak out loud about it. And then we're going to go, keep going through a couple of thoughts and ideas, and then we'll open it up to a larger conversation. So the first question I have, and each of you will have 2 minutes to respond, is the action plan offers an opportunity for a whole of government approach to policy related to African Nova Scotians. How realistic do we think this process is, and who will be accountable for the plan's success? So how realistic do we think the process is, and who will be accountable for the plan's success? We'll start this way.
Oh, I get to start on.
Yes.
Is this on? No.
Are you also on mute?
How?
Is mine on? Oh, yeah.
Okay, try
Hello?
Oh, yeah.
No, try
No?
that
Oh, wait, I just did something.
one. Don't do that.
Don't touch it.
Oh, Wayn can always break something.
It says it's not on mute.
No, it doesn't.
Tap the mic.
I know.
Tap
Do you
your
want to use
mic.
mine?
Oh, yeah, you're on.
Hello. Okay, so first of all, as I fiddle with my mic, I want to apologize. I have to be in Truro, so I have to leave this panel before you can ask me questions. I have to leave at 6, so I'll just drop things and exit Black History Month for you. So I think that question around who is accountable for this is really a question, I think, about where political change comes from. So does political change come within the system? Does it come from working outside in the system, or does it come from the streets? My perspective is that change comes from the bottom up. So I'm not sure that when we create a policy plan, there's a couple of things. So first of all, Black people have historically been left out of policy, and policy is made without us, so that even when an issue is really talking about us, we are absent. So cannabis policy is an example where cannabis policy has always been anti-Black, yet we never mention Black people. We're never at the table when we talk about cannabis policy. So we're present but absent. So it's very important in that sense that we are included in policy. But at the same time, the making of policy that happens at the level of government decision or consultation, to me, I'm not sure is an act of liberation. I think liberation politics is where we're organizing our communities, and that comes through long-term organizational processes. So what does it mean to talk about justice if a government that's talking about justice is also a government that is engaged in street checks, a government that has yet to account for that, a government that runs prisons in this province where we see black people, we'll talk about justice later, but black people being 2% of the population, being 14% of the adult provincial prisons and 16% of the youth prisons. So how can that government therefore account for justice? Our government is responsible for engaging in deportation policies. That's the federal government, but we also collude with that provincially. We saw that with the case of Abdul Abdi, who was denied his citizenship while he was in foster care and then eligible for deportation. So can justice come from government? Can recognition come from government? Can development come from government, or does it come within community? And this has been the task, the 500-year task of African people. Our greatest minds throughout history have been devoted to this question of, once we have colonization, once we have slavery, how do we work our way out of it? And we see our black geniuses have been thinking upon this for centuries. And we've been engaged in this work through Fanon, through Angela Davis, through Cabral, all of these great figures that have asked us this question. So is one document going to encapsulate that, the work that we need to do, not only to push back institutions and decolonize, but in our communities? How do we deal with tenancy and housing shortages? So how do we organize ourselves to fight back against the loss of housing? How do we organize ourselves to get health care? How do we organize ourselves when, pregnant black women's babies are dying at incredibly high rates? How do we organize ourselves when mothers on assistance are consistently being cut off? How do we organize ourselves when our babies are being taken into the child welfare system at such high rates? How do we organize ourselves when the education system is designed to push us out at all phases? And the answer to that has to come in community. It has to come from this daily work of saying, how are mothers going to be organized? How are grandmothers going to be organized? And I don't think any policy plan will ever take account for that. I think the accountability comes from us within our communities, and then we shame public institutions. We go in front of them, we open the locked doors, and we stand in front of them. And it's by raising that voice and continually being in the streets and always being in our communities that this change comes. So.
Oh, thank you all. Wow, thank you. Crystal.
So I have to follow you. That's interesting. I agree. I think that there needs to be some grassroots movement with the policy. However, it does exist. And how do we position ourselves as community members to be able to move this forward? How can we, I guess, hold government accountable to move the statements that they have written in here forward? And I think that involves us having folks that have had the experience at those tables to continue to prod government to move these things forward. So I'm always very challenged when particular strategies and stuff like that come out from government, particularly because of the relationship that I have to have with government in my work. And I'm always wondering, okay, so what's the plan to implement this? And who's going to be involved in making sure that that particular plan or those priorities are identified and move forward? So I think there's a mixture of having those grassroots individuals, but also those folks at the table that can take those grassroots ideas and put them into practice. And I think that's often quite absent when it comes to government policy.
Great, thank you. Wayn.
Yeah, as someone who works inside of government structures and who has partly authored this document, I want to put a couple of things in context and agreeing with what I'm hearing from my panelists. And that is that this document didn't start in 2015. This document began during the World Conference on Racism down in South Africa, when the member states didn't agree. Canada was not a signatory to that. But the civil society part of that conference put effort to say to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, continue with this dialogue around racism because it's not done. You fast forward that to 2015, when at the United Nations, there was an agreement finally, after 10 years of negotiations, to have this thing called a decade. And there's been complete silence for a number of years from the member states. Nova Scotia is not a member of the UN system. Canada is. So we were waiting with a bated breath for the government of the day the federal government, to step into that space, and they didn't. And the work that we do, it's internal facing to government, and as much as we can is external facing. So we decided that we cannot wait, that there's got to be a window of opportunity to do this transformational shift. And to Elle's point about the need to put the pressure, the need to make sure that there's some kind of a connectedness to government, does require 10,000 public employees in the province of Nova Scotia to see this thing called Count Us In as them being part of this. And this document was driven by the fact of an African proverb that says, it takes 3 stones to cook the pot. You need the folks that are closely connected to this to make the difference. This document for us is the first one in this North American jurisdiction that tries to take imaginative words, that's aspirational words, and turn them into something tangible. So it has taken us at least 2 years to get the rightness of what we're trying to say to government and to community about we've got to try something. We can't afford to wait any longer because I do believe there is this possibility that's in front of us. We just got to seize it. And on that note, we're trying to take a page out of what has already happened in this province with the restorative inquiry, which talked about the shift from protecting the system to really doing a responsibility to those that are most affected. So we are working inside of government for them to say, this plan requires us to have a difference, because as professionals, you say, no, I'm only supposed to do this, because that's what the rule says. We're saying, dismiss the rule and talk about the problem. It's not about accountability, it's about responsibility. So we're trying to push as hard as we can with the folks that I work with for them to understand that this document, it may be aspirational and it may have some flaws, but it's something that we can build on. And as it relates to how the community will have to have a level of accountability, we've created for the first time a ministerial group of deputies who are challenging themselves now to say, how do we invite community into these spaces? And these spaces will be probably driven by the sector. So there will be something that talks about the notion of justice. But our justice is around social justice as well as the notion of the institutional ways that we look at justice. The same thing for development. So there's a number of opportunities for the African Nova Scotia community groups that want to champion that, in my opinion, to create that space and create that dialogue. But that's going to take time, and it's going to take us a lot of effort to change that mentality inside of the provincial government system that says, you are not the owners of the expertise. The expertise is with the community. And that shift in thinking from the folks that I'm working with, I can't say that it's there, but it's better than it was last year. It's better than it was yesterday. And that's all that I have to go on.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Lindell.
I'll be quick because I agree. Can you hear me? Check 1, 2.
Yeah.
Break on 1, 9. To expand really quickly on 2 things that Al said. One, it's so important to switch the pyramid because a lot of the work that I've done in the past and still doing today, when you really get the community to determine what those outcomes and what those goals and what the priorities are, not only the community signs up, but then the government, I am government, so I'll say the government cannot say that this isn't what the people want. And when you look at documents like this, there's too many times where the government will say, we did a document, now the community got to sign on board. Great, but there also is an understanding, especially with a system that has pushed us out for so long, how can you expect us as community members to navigate a system that was built for us not to thrive? So there's also that aspect of what will the government do to make sure the folks who want to organize, have the supports they need, are included in the process, and still have a say in it. And that's a difficult bounce, but for me, it doesn't go anywhere unless the accountability comes from the community, but also the government is helping that accountability be something, because again, you can't expect folks who are dealing with all the issues you mentioned to be able to navigate government. It just the 2 things don't work, but it should be government's job to make sure that they can navigate it and hold us accountable.
Thank you. Wow, those are some fantastic opening remarks. Settle in, because it's going to get good. It's going to get gooder. So, so I like this piece around all of you in some ways spoke to this gap of knowledge around being able to identify and name and, I'll use the word again, acknowledge the contributions that African Nova Scotians have made, everyday life, systems lives, right? And the structure of Nova Scotia and the various places that we've worked. How do you think we should go about, what are some of the steps you think we should take about acknowledging the contributions that African Nova Scotians have made? What do you think the province should do? How do we elevate that knowledge? So many of us, right? I'm new to the province, so I'm learning exponentially. But there's folks who've been here for forever and may not know, right? Outside, east, west of here, provinces going west may not know. So how do we elevate this knowledge around the vibrant contributions of African Nova Scotians? So we have 15 minutes for this section. I have 2 other questions, but let's start there, and then I'll interject with the other questions. All right? Who'd like to start?
I'll go. So Nova Scotia does a great job of speaking about the contributions that African Nova Scotians have done. If you look at African Heritage Month in particular, you hear these names, and even schools nowadays, it's in the curriculum. They have to learn about contributions and et cetera, et cetera. But the issue that I see with that as well is there's also that broader piece, as you mentioned, when it comes to outside Nova Scotia. But even, how many buildings are named after African Nova Scotians or people of color? Let's take African Nova Scotia piece, or people of color who've contributed to what we've seen in Nova Scotia. And you could probably not name very many. I know there's someone in the room who has a room named after themselves. I won't mention who that person is, but we love your contributions that you do to our community. But how do you also make folks see that? Because if we're not acknowledging it, not just through African Heritage Month, not just through textbooks, but also through like the growth and economics and all that, that is to me where we really see that being important.
Wayn,
Yeah, sorry. We're going to be relaunching a program soon, and it's called Community Voices. And it flips this notion on its head that we have to wait to be telling others that we're important. And what this program is going to try to attempt is allow the community to tell the story of who they are and what they're all about. We field tested it with Lincolnville and in Whitney Pier. And what it was a number of conversations that happened in the community, just posing the question, how did this community come about? What are the kind of things that really are important to this community that ought to be recognized? This was done deliberately to move away from the academic or historian point of view. But what was most powerful in Lincolnville, we asked some of the residents, what are the sites of memory that you think ought to be around? And some of the elders were really struggling to understand what I meant. And I said, well, where did you get baptized? And all of a sudden, there was a conversation that was way different. So the question was, why isn't there something there for your grandson to know where that happened?
Right.
And I said, don't wait for government. That's community voice, plaquing it yourself. So when we talk about this recognition that's in this document, it's about the community taking ownership of that recognition, sites of significance. It's the community taking ownership of the community voice that says, this is who we are, this is how we came about. And it wasn't about the idea of having it from an academic point of view that it was 1786. The community doesn't really necessarily need to know that. They just need to know that here's the founding community members. So the point that we're going to be trying to make under the recognition pillar is to allow both of those things. The things that you talked about that we don't do enough naming internally, but we've got to allow the community to say, we need to take ownership of our own voice for recognition. So our hope is that this will allow communities to stimulate the conversation amongst themselves. Because I do believe things, those baptismal places, the one-room schoolhouses, we got to remember where those are. Because if we don't, they're going to be lost forever, and as if they weren't there in the first place.
It's such an interesting discussion around archives, right? Everyone's like, where's the archive? But I think our archives often look differently. I wondered if you would ask me about what an archive looked like in one of our conversations. Like it could be the photo album, or it could be, for some people it's the documents they placed in the Bible. For other people, it could be, the scraps of paper, you know, when you force your parent or your grandparent to actually write down recipes, right? So, you know, like those kinds of things. And so I think for scholars, we might think of what you said as an archive, but for the rest of us, that's the story that Auntie tells us, you know, while she's braiding our hair, right?
That's the memories.
Right, exactly. Crystal, Al?
Yeah, I was just thinking that so much of what I remember about those historical places in the community came from walking around the community with my cousins or my aunts or uncles and hearing those particular stories, and not, I think, oh gosh, I have to put my researcher hat on for a minute, but I guess I'm thinking about having the opportunity to understand the non-traditional ways in which we need to acknowledge the contributions of African Nova Scotians or anyone of African heritage in Nova Scotia, because there's this conformity that we have to kind of align ourselves with, and that doesn't work. And so, I mean, you can throw the whole cultural competence phrase around, but in some instances, it's really necessary for us to move away from some of the Eurocentric approaches to doing things and be more mindful of how important it is for us to center ourselves and allow others to be immersed in what those cultural nuances are in order for us to be acknowledged.
Yeah, so I think the question is also, why do we remember, and what's the point? So there's this cosmetic way in which recognition can take place where, you know, you could name every room in this building after a black person, but if you're not hiring black faculty and black students can't get through, and you're not getting black people into their PhDs, then, like, what does it matter, right? So there's that cosmetic way it happens. I have a joke about Viola Desmond on the 10, which is like, now we can get racially consumer profiled, you know, in stores, and we try to give our money with a black woman on it. But the deeper question is that those lessons from history are actually necessary for us to decolonize, right? So this is where people are talking about these stories that come from our aunties or our grandmothers. Those just aren't stories, they're strategies of survival. Indigenous people are returning to what they already know, to say, like, we were already sustaining this environment. We were already living in this earth in these ways that now Europeans are trying to return to. And it's the same thing for black people, right? We have these knowledges. And this memory isn't just about holding something in the past and nostalgia and then putting on a building to recognize. It's saying, our elders went through everything that we went through, and we're repeating it again. So when I'm trying to deal with, like, the police, you know, Rocky was dealing with the police in the 1960s, and when I read Rocky's biography, his autobiography, he's giving me strategies that are still active today. When I talk to Lynn Jones about holding meetings, the way that Lynn knows how to run a meeting is gained from all this knowledge that is about organizing, right? And so part of why we need to acknowledge and understand where we come from and understand our communities is that our communities knew how to live. They knew how to do things like farm the land and live in it. They knew how to do justice with each other. They knew how to house each other. They knew how to do childcare. All of these things that often now we're struggling to return to. So I think it's not just that we hold it in the past, it's that what does the past mean to us in terms of imagining these futures that we have to move forward into. So I think that's also the question.
You know, it reminds me of, you know, the Black Panthers read diligently, like Che Guevara, Fanon, right, others, as a way to set up the health clinic, as a way to, you know, understand how to address the system that was harming them, right? And that's that very practice, right? That's in some ways what the stories tell us. The stories are the lessons, but, you know, there's, I think that if you phrase it as a story, that it's not as vital or not as reliable as a document, right? As something that you can read. So speaking of that, I'm wondering, where's the place for data in this, right? So I know data, data, but then there's many of us that are like, no, we need data, right? So there's this tension and this challenge, and so let's speak through that. So the province will say, you know, we don't have enough data, there's a lot of data gaps regarding African Nova Scotians, great. But then let's think of, you know, the historical ways that Black people have been datafied and cataloged and categorized. And so there was a tension, right? And there's this unique way that in Canada, data isn't collected in the same ways on Black people. And then the assumption is that there were no Black people, right? Or this is not a Black issue, right? So there's no data, therefore no Black people. How do we respond to that tension around data? Province needs data, Do we need data? And does that harm us, help us, both?
Yeah, I think we need to have, the community needs to, oh, sorry. I think the community needs to have a conversation about who we are and what we're all about. I do know that there are gaps in the data, but I think we can come really close to understanding what some of those problems and those issues are if we're prepared to drop the silos to be able to share whatever data is there. So Department of Education has a lot of data out in the rural areas. I don't know whether or not that data would be shared with the folks that are in Department of Health, because they'll talk about the privacy and this and that. But you can pull together, and we have been able to say back to government departments, here's what the problem is. We got to try to go out and try to either fix it or ameliorate it. We did that with Project Brotherhood. Or Nova Scotia Brotherhood, we were saying black men have a lot of problems going to see a doctor. There's a lot of things that are not manifest. And at the first instance, a lot of folks in the government said, well, we don't have any data. And we kept saying, yeah, you do have the data. You do have the data. If you just think about who is going to hospitals, who's going to see this, the incidence of prostate cancer, the incidence of high stress and all that. So finally, after they got their heads thinking about, yeah, this is possible, we were able to get enough resources to have a small little clinic that was set up here in Nova Scotia. But Lincolnville doesn't have it. Lakeele doesn't have it. Amherst doesn't have it. There's so many other places where black men's health ought to be there. And so we're saying we don't wait for the data, because if you wait, we're going to lose another generation. But I think the community has to have a conversation about what does it mean to be who we are. Because as you can imagine, we're going through this transition again of how we name ourselves, who's in and who's out. Are you from away? Are you recently here? That really is, in some ways, a bit of a problem. And we've got to try to overcome it by having the conversations, not with government, but amongst ourselves. And that's what I hope that we will be doing with this data collection, is asking the community, why are we collecting this data? What's it for? And the data, once you get it, you still have to analyze it. For what purpose? So sometimes we can get caught up in that notion of the data and not thinking about why. Why do we need it? Because we know some of the answers.
Yes. Other thoughts on?
Well,
Put the hat back on.
I know. I love the idea of having data, and I really love the idea of it being gathered in non-traditional ways. I do think, though, that kind of to build on what, I'm going to call you Uncle Wayn here.
Okay, niece.
To build on what you said, that we need to create some sort of I guess, a way for us to be able to hold those folks that come into our community accountable for when they want to take the data.
Yes.
And we don't have those kinds of approaches in place right now.
Like a data protocol or
Yeah,
something.
we don't have anything like that. And so as firmly as I stand on accessing or gathering data, I still think that we need to have some processes in place for us to be able to ensure that that data is used ethically.
Agreed.
Yeah, but I think we need it. We can't make decisions about it. We know that there are particular challenges within our community, and everybody always says, well, can you prove that? Well, I'm telling you. You should be able to take my word. This is the fact that I'm telling you orally should be enough for you to understand that it's important. This is the way I communicate, and that's not always the way that's accepted.
Okay. Elle or Lindell?
Yeah, I'm very interested in this idea of the aftermath of reports. So say with the Wortley report, and what happens when you have a report that comes in and is dropped. And there's particular ways in which things are made legible, that you can use that report in court, for example, to talk about, here's proof of police profiling. I've seen it used in cases. So there's some ways in which that becomes productive, but there's also ways in which things like these reports, I think, stall liberation work. I think we become very focused on the moment that, a report has come out, and then it's like, we're at the beck and call of this report, and everything becomes on the timeline of that report and consulting about that report, and then we're not actually organizing ourselves. And we know that when these reports come out, we're still going to be dealing with the same issue 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So I'm always interested in that, like what happens in this aftermath. And I think what we've consistently seen happen is we see this lull where we're like, okay, we've been fighting against police, we've been fighting against police, oh, we got this report. And it's almost like we want to take this breath because we've been fighting, but then we completely fall out. And then what white supremacy does is reorganize in all these new ways. And then 10 years from now, you're back fighting, you know, the thing. So where I'm always suspicious is, and sorry, I guess I'm the out of the system person, but I'm always suspicious when there's a government plan, because the government loves to move the goalposts. So you say, okay, you know, we have black people in prison. The government wants to come back at you and go, like, let's get more black wardens and black guards. And like, or we could let black people out of prison, you know? And like, that's never the plan, you know? Then we're just going to move to cult. And then 10 years from now, I'm just going to be fighting through the cultural worker in prison. Or, well, we have black wardens, so it can't be racist. And you're always fighting against that new space. And that's something Glenn Coulthard talks about with Indigenous people, the politics of recognition, right? And he talks about how recognition becomes important to the Canadian government because they're trying to assimilate Indigenous people. And they use this idea of recognizing Indigenous people in order to remove sovereignty. So it can be good. Like, yes, you know, when we say, like, this thing we've been telling you for decades, it's true. You know, we are in prison. We are, like, it's important to us, and it makes us legible, it makes us hurt. But the danger of it is it becomes overdetermined in these ways, and we get caught up in that report or that data. And again, we have to return to, this system is always going to be there, and we always have to wake up the next day and fight it in its new form, and that's what's difficult.
Yeah, and, oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
I just want to say that sometimes it gets into evidence-based. And you can validate that so many ways, but yet it's still evidence-based.
Yes.
So what we're trying to do with the work we do is say, it'll be evidence-based to the level where the community says it's evidence-based. And you're gonna have to go with that. Sometimes it works and sometimes it's a bit of a fight.
Did you want to add? You know, yes?
Well, no, Al, you pretty much summed up. So,
Means you're first up next.
yeah, which is fine, I'll take it.
You know, and I was also going to say, we find this as researchers, as black scholars in a university, or scholars doing, no, mostly black scholars in the university who are applying for research grants that specifically focus on black people or focus on anti-black racism. And then the response when it's not funded, and there's stats around what gets funded, what isn't. So in the response when it's not funded is this lack of evidence that the statement you're making, that you want to look at the impacts of anti-black racism. And so the response is often, how do you know there's anti-black racism? And so you get these are the tensions, right, about who is the report for, who holds the documents, who holds the data, who holds our samples, and then how can we use that for our own liberation? These are part of those discussions. And you know, we could go on. So let me move on to the next theme. Or I guess I could go on. So let me move on to the next theme. So we're going to talk about justice for the next 15 minutes. Are you here? Are you with us? Yes? This is like fire, right? Like you're feeling this? All right, okay. So on a very, very, very cold day in January, I was with a bunch of other people standing outside of a Walmart in Halifax, protesting the racial profiling and subsequent arrest of Santina Rao. So the provincial government has it stated, permanently banned street checks. But we then see this incident with Santina Rao. The document that we're talking about today also cites, and I quote, cites as an action, and I quote, improving relationships between police and African Nova Scotian communities, end quote. So let me start with the question, what does that look like to you?
That's a difficult one because it can mean something different for everybody. So, you know, for me in particular, like now being in government, what that means is that we need to meet people where they're at and not be afraid to be held accountable as government and as police forces. But again, we're talking about a system, like the government system as a whole has oppressed black people, but we're talking about police. And now you want to build a relationship with black people when it comes to police. I don't know how that looks. And really, this is something where, you know, going back to what I said earlier is we need community to determine what that is, but we also need government to give those tools. This is a perfect example. So, the report and what I was going to say, but I'll hit on it, is the report is great, but we've already said that this is happening. So why do we need a report? The data's there, great. So now the piece is, as a people, if the police really want to build those relationships and really want to see that gap mended, there's going to have to be some soul searching of the police force and of government. And we should not expect the community to come to the table, because that's not on them. It's on us as government to do that work and do it in a thoughtful way. But we're also dealing with, there are people who take on those roles as police officers or folks in justice because of power, and they want to be able to say they want to determine how you do things. So how do you get past that piece? How do you get past people who want to be enforcers, but also how do you work with officers and other folks in the justice system who actually care and want to work? I had a phone call with an officer last week who's fed up because he sticks up, a white officer, he sticks up for people, and he's always being labeled as a token because he's sticking up for black officers. So how do you deal with a system like that and expect community to want to come to the table? So it's a difficult one, but I think we could get there. But it's really organizing is the piece.
Go ahead. I just want to say two things. I think that there's got to be a better way to figure out who actually puts on that uniform. And I don't believe that there's the right kind of training for those that are in law enforcement. And I really push back when people say public safety. Because if I don't feel safe, and it's because of the color of my skin, that should be part of public safety. So one of the big conversations that needs to happen is to build up that trust factor, because it's at zero as it relates to the Afro-Nova Scotia community. And to the point that was made, it's not on the community. It's on those individuals that put on that uniform for the right kinds of reasons. So the biggest challenge within that regard is how do you begin to create the right kind of a space for every rank and file officer to do what they're supposed to do. And that's, to me, is the most frustrating part, is because I think there are some good police officers, black or white, that are really trying to do better by their communities. But it only takes that one or two incidences and then like zero trust. And to give you an example, I was explaining to somebody, I have a problem dropping off a vehicle at 2 o'clock at night at a rental place. And the other person I was talking to was white, and they said, why? They had no concept of what I was talking about. And so they went home and they reflected on that, and then they came back because it's about this learning. And they said, what you said made sense, Wayn, because when I drop off a vehicle, I don't look around, I don't do nothing, I don't even think about it. But the way that you described the fact that you as a black man dropping off that car at 2 o'clock, that triggered something in me, and it allowed me to think it through. And you're right, those police officers probably making a whole bunch of biased, racial, negative assumptions about me dropping off a car. That's where it starts. It's the mentality that some of those police officers have about who we are. We've already got the frame in their mind about, that person is really going to be something I have to keep my eye on. So we push all the time with the folks to say, it's who puts on that uniform that should be the beginning of how to build that trust.
Crystal?
Yeah, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about the police is the history of the police and why they exist in the first place. And if you don't know, you should probably look it up. But essentially, it's about, keeping black people in their place.
Keeping them enslaved.
And not providing them the opportunity to live freely in society, whether it's a curfew or not being in a particular community at a certain time of night. I mean, I remember growing up here in Halifax and telling my mother where I was going to go, well, you better not be around that particular area. And I was born in the 70s, so you wouldn't think that those particular things would be happening at that point. And so I guess for me, it's very challenging for me to think that anything good can come from any sort of anything the police. Like, I really have a strong mistrust. I understand that, you know, I have family members that carry the badge, wear the uniform, and if it wasn't for them, my perception of police officers would be probably a lot more damaged than it is.
Okay. Yeah. And I know you have to go,
Yeah, I'll
so
just
why
add
don't
a
you do
little
this?
bit. I think
Yes.
also, as well as policing as a practice, like the actual police, policing is also an ideology. It's a thought structure.
Sorry, and also add about prisons, because that's.
Yes, so, I mean, there's actual police officers, but there's also, you know, the way we police the border and, you know, the idea of nation, which is based on policing, who's in and who's out. We're seeing this with, like, the coronavirus, right? It's like,
Yes.
oh, we need to, like, stop Chinese people from coming in. That's Chinese people, and that's about policing, right? We do all kinds of policing of people's gender and sexuality. We do all kinds of policing in the child welfare system, which is about coming into people's homes, particularly black women's homes, and policing what do you have in your cupboard. I mean, a social worker can open your cupboard, they can go through your fridge, they can look in your child's bedroom, they can go through your underwear drawer. You know, all of that is policing, right? Robin Maynard talks about this a lot in Policing Black Lives. So we also have to talk about how even if we change the way we train police, the ideology of control and discipline of black people and the anti-blackness that embeds into that would still be existing, and we just use something else that wasn't the police, which we see in consumer profiling, we see in all these other ways, or the ways that like white people appoint themselves as the police and like call the police on you when they see you in the street. You know, so what has to be undone is that kind of ideology. Like, why do we have a prison in the first place, and why is it a colonial institution, and who is it intended to capture, and who is it, why are 42% of Indigenous women in federal prison?
Yes.
Like, I mean, 42% of the federal prison is Indigenous women. Are they committing, is this a big crime wave we all just haven't noticed? Or is that about killing off Indigenous people, right? So I think it's also, like, we can't just say, okay, if we just give the police this training, we just do this and this and this. We also have to look at how is policing itself as a concept embedded in the colonial structure. I have time for one more question.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So, okay, I want to get to the other question, and now.
Sorry, I'm messing up the panel.
No, you're not. Stop. You are directing the flow, and that's always good. All right, so let's move on to development. And we're going to talk about education, employment, health, and communities. So we know that race is a determinant of health. I wonder if we can talk about the challenges of chronic disease, limited healthcare access, underrepresentation of African Nova Scotian healthcare providers. Where do we begin when addressing health outcomes of African Nova Scotian communities? And then a little piece about education. How do we break this school to prison pipeline cycle in our education? So those are two options before you have to take off, and you're going to start, because I want you to have time.
So school to prison pipeline, which again is about policing, right? So the heavy suspensions in the Halifax Regional School Board, you see black kids suspended 3 times their rate of presence in the school. So again, we see how teachers are policing. We know that black kids are seen like 3 to 4 times 8 years older than their actual age. So these unconscious things that are embedded in teachers. And we know also that the way the school environment works also prepares people to be surveyed. So the introduction of cameras, the introduction of certain ways of policing people in the hallways. Some schools are making you wear like lanyards and carry ID. And what does that say about the way that you're accustoming children to being watched and policed in particular ways? So part of the school to prison pipeline is about that and the environment. And then the other part is the relationship between the suspension and disciplining out of kids and how that very much leads into the prison system. So when you're policing out a young girl and suspending her, she becomes extremely vulnerable to sexual exploitation, for example. And the #1 determinant of a woman being criminalized is sexual exploitation in her childhood. There's a sex abuse to prison pipeline as well. So if the education system is not serving that girl, she is so vulnerable. So we need to look at that role of the school as a colonial institution as well. I know people get into this. I mean, it's beyond curriculum and teachers. It's also like, what does it mean to remove a child from their home environment and the people they're around and the way they want to learn and put them in a foreign environment, quite literally busing people, you know, out of communities into foreign spaces and then expecting that will educate that child. Well, it's like a violent process, right? People in this province undergo a very violent process of assimilation through education, and we wonder what the problem is. And then when it comes to health, those things are, I'm trying to do this so fast, those things are connected. I mean, spiritual health, mental health, physical health are all connected. So from the moment of birth, the moment a child is in the womb, a black child is being differentially treated. We know that pregnant mothers, black mothers, are not believed about, you know, how they are experiencing. Like Black people are considered to experience less pain, which is a relic from slavery. So from the time that you're in the womb, you're being policed or not considered fully human. We see babies born the way that the Apgar scale goes that like has
ridiculous.
racial connotations to that. So when you think about that, your entire contact with the healthcare system, so how, again, can we expect Black people to be in good health when the very way that you move around the society is intended to kill you and is intended to destroy your health? And then quite literally structurally, you don't have, I mean, how do you go get mental health problems when there's like 4 Black psychiatrists and they're like overbooked? So you're gonna spend your session trying to explain to somebody like your own experience. Then I should be paid to be teaching the psychiatrist. Like, so like, how am I supposed to get therapy? And how am I supposed to be in good physical health when I live a stressful life and by the time I get home, I need to recover and I'm not cooking or I'm not taking time for myself or I'm not involved in care, right? So all of those things impact us, and it's really, we are a holistic people as well, right? We experience all of these things as one. And when we're experiencing this deathly environment for Black people, because make no mistake, this environment is here to hurt us. It is here to harm us. And when we experience the health effects of that harm, that is not deliberate. That is actually like what we're supposed to be experiencing. And on that note,
and on that,
Literal mic drop.
I know, right? Cha.
sorry, thank you. I'm sorry to be disruptive.
Please join me in thanking Elle Jones. Safe travels to Truro. Safe travels.
Thank you, guys.
All right. So, if there was another thought about policing I'm going to move over. If there's another thought about policing you wanted to make, go ahead. A piece around health and how we think about race as a determinant of health, and also how do we respond to that for our communities. But then that piece around school to prison pipelines, right? So I know it's all really dense.
Yeah.
So where would you like to start?
Well, I know for me, I think there's not enough acknowledgement that racism is a determinant of health.
Agreed.
You know, like we aren't bold enough in healthcare, in education, to say that, because it's uncomfortable for people to talk about. Like, it's uncomfortable for folks to say that individuals of African descent, in particular, don't get the health care that they require, that the tests that they have to endure are not the ones that were tested for them. Like, it's just like trial and error. And so I think that by all accounts, no matter what sector, we need to acknowledge that racism is a determinant of health. And I tend to think of health very holistically, obviously, you know, the whole spiritual piece, but whatever is happening with me physically could also be happening or be caused by what's happening in my environment. And so I think we need to move beyond that. When you talk about the school to prison pipeline, I'm talking about the preschool to prison pipeline. We're seeing more children in daycare that their parents are being called and saying, you need to come and get your son because they're disruptive and they're not sitting down and learning. And how about you change the way you teach and make it so that those children are able to learn. And it's for someone who's doing research around children and play, like their playgrounds are surveilled. Like, yes. We've heard about kids in the States being shot in the playground. Yes. So I mean, it's a lot bigger issue than what we're choosing to admit and acknowledge. And so until that time that folks are comfortable with saying that we need to acknowledge racism and anti-Black racism in particular, then it's very difficult to see or to not see things move forward, I guess.
Agreed. Wayn or Lindell?
Yeah, I think this is one topic that I would hope that the community becomes a lot more aggressive towards the system to talk about the change. Studies will show that by the age of grade 3, the kids learn how to read. But going forward, you got to read to learn. And we miss out on that second phase because you start to get labeled. And I really, really hope that various community groups will not just allow whatever comes home from the teacher to say, this is how your child is, to say, and accept it. There was a time when there used to be a lot of effort put on education committees. And the system has a way of remorphing itself.
Yes.
So then rules came along that said, no, if you want to enter into the school system, it'll be through the student support workers and not necessarily the parents.
Right.
And then they changed the student support workers so that they were much more inclusive of everybody, as opposed to what they were designed for in the beginning was for the African Nova Scotia community and the students that they have under their care. It's going to be an opportunity, though, I think, if the community puts the right kind of, this is not acceptable, so that the Department of Education and other instruments of government and also the teaching institutions understand that dynamic. And I think as Canadians, we're not mature enough to talk about race, to your point. And we've got to try to keep making people feel uncomfortable if they really truly want to come along to try to change. And I do know that people find it emotional to talk about this notion of race or racism, but there's no other way other than to have that respectful dialogue so it can be revealed how bad it is, because we are the ones that are experiencing it day in, day out. With regards to the health issue, that in and of itself, I think, is telling for what's happening here in this province because the numbers are so stark.
Yes.
And if we do think about where data could really actually show,
I agree.
all those indices would show that the impact of race has affected every family in this province.
Yes.
So how do we keep the Department of Health and health authorities accountable? I do believe it's allowing that community voice to keep at it. And eventually we'll have people on the inside that will say, yeah, we've got to create these opportunities in these spaces. Okay. It's a long haul.
It is.
But the idea is that we should never assume that it can't be done. Because if that's the case, we'd still be in change. And I refuse to say that these things can't be overcome. It's just keeping the focus on it.
Right, right. Thank you, Lindell.
How much time do we have?
How much time do we got?
A day.
In about how long?
I knew that.
Okay.
I knew that.
Yeah.
So I'll speak on one of the subjects.
Sure.
So the education aspect, to me, is very passionate around that because, you know, for many reasons, growing up being a kid who got all 90s, not being accepted in a school because of my address. No other reason, but then my white counterpart, who was in the same class as me, same school, who went to the school that I couldn't get in, and they got in that same day. And that's when I understood, oh my goodness, this education system is not made for me to succeed. From then on, really, it was really important for me to be in schools and to work with teachers and administrators to really understand what is happening in the schools. And, you know, a big shout out to all the teachers who are trying to make those systemic changes. There's a few in the room, and, you know, a lot of times we say, you know, we need more black teachers or more teachers that represent the kids, sure, but we also should put onus on the teachers who are not of color, who are not of those backgrounds, who should be doing that work, and to put that onus on them, on a person because they are of color. They might have no interest. So we need to make sure that we're also providing that support. You know, in Nova Scotia in particular, we have so many bodies that focus on education, so many reports that have studied how education affects us, whether it's IPPs, individual program plans, whether it's suspensions, whether it's grades, and we're still seeing some of the same outcomes and data from years, like early 90s. I think the Black Report was 94 or something. So, you know, that's where it gets really frustrating because we're not talking about, you know, health is important. We're also talking about the education. These are kids who are going to need this education to move forward in life. And if they're not getting it at the beginning, and then when they fail later in life, we blame where they come from, we blame their environment, their parents, but we don't blame the education system, which is to me, part of the social determinants of health, but also that's a huge piece because how many hours do kids spend in school a
right.
day with people who care and some who don't.
Yes.
So to me, the education piece is a huge issue.
I thank you so much, all of you, and Elle, who's not here. I think, the piece that you all spoke to was how to disrupt the overwhelming commitment to objectivity when what is happening isn't objective, right? And so I think there's this conflation where people believe that if they're colorblind and they're being objective, when in fact what they're doing is relying on Eurocentric notions of what is normal, right? And it's why anytime we speak about examples, the very many examples of anti-Black racism or racial harassment and racial violence, the response is always one of shock. How could that happen? Because the belief is that, well, in the everyday, this shouldn't be, right? The objective, everyday practice. But then if we could actually, again, this is why I think land acknowledgements are important in acknowledging the way in which colonialism and anti-Black racism manifest. If we truly understand the impacts of colonialism and anti-Black racism, then we would understand the structures of policing. Then we would understand the structures of education. Then we would even understand the measurements of what is healthy and what is not healthy, right? What causes illness, and why we are always considered to be suspicious, right? But for example, the police officers are always telling the truth, or doctors are always has our best interests, or teachers always want the best for us, right? Right? And these are just some of the ways that white supremacy and Eurocentrism continue to manifest and occupy these positions of being objective, or I don't even see color, or things like that. All right, questions. I know you have a lot. All right. Oh, are you going to be yes, perfect. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi. Oh, yes. I don't have a question. I'm just a mic runner.
Okay. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, please put your hand up. We have some time.
Some questions in the back.
Yes, so please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Greg Nazaire, and teach corporate finance at the Faculty of Management. And thank you very much for your comments and things. There is two comments I would like to basically to reconcile. It's when you say lack of evidence on one side, and another side we talk about how white supremacy, how it's being reorganized. There was a time it was name calling, right? It was name calling. It was sometimes, I'll say vulgarity. Now we have basically a reorganization. Now it's not physical, but it's basically without evidence, I will say. Lack of evidence, we don't have the evidence. And this is why sometimes we call it, systemic racism. You cannot see it anymore. It's been more sophisticated, right? It's almost when you can call it death by 1,000 cuts. You cannot see it anymore. Once in a while you have a microaggression, you have micro-invalidation. Sometimes you have even some campaign of dehumanization, right? To remove all form of, legitimacy. And on the other side, they can basically restructure an organization in any business where you are. And then they say, you know what? We don't have any space for you anymore. It's almost like, we change the system, we change the organization, we change the priorities. So you don't have anywhere to sit anymore because we change our priorities. So there's no evidence. There's no evidence. We change the policies, we change the strategies, but too bad for you, you don't have a job, right? But if you see it, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. Everything is being structured in a way you accommodate the majority, the white majority, right? You preserve some the privilege, and you exclude the others. And when we talk about EDI, we talk about inclusion, corporate inclusion, we have to understand, I don't have to call you names, right? I don't have to. All I have to do, I can put a job application together where even Einstein won't qualify. That's the way it is now. There's no evidence. So you may be a victim of racism or systemic racism at work, but it's gonna be up to you to actually to prove it. Not the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Right? It's something we keep talking about it again and again and again, but what do we plan to do? And I'm not talking about the presenters. I'm talking about people who are actually literally supposed to be doing something about it. It's not going to be just February. I'm sorry.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
All right?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You're right. We are in this moment where there could be racism without racists, or there's a racist incident that occurred, but nobody's responsible, or it wasn't intended, and because it wasn't intended, therefore it's not really a racist incident. So we're in these moments now, and you're right. How are decision makers responding to the demands that they make decisions? It's a good question. There's a mic over here, yes? Please say your name.
Hi, my name is Jamie Keats, and just a guy from the streets. Basically, I agree, first of all, with that statement. I've experienced it myself in the corporate world, where if you feel you've been discriminated, there's a lack of evidence. That's what they say. They come to you, there's no evidence. How can it be racist? Our VP of whatever is a black person. So this is what we face on the daily. But my question is, why should we trust the government? Like my first interaction with the police here, there was like two kids cutting school. One black kid, one black male, one white female. The cops stopped them. Apparently there'd been like a tussle earlier on with some other kids. The cops were like telling this young girl to go to school. You should be in school. And the young guy, they're like, almost like they want to arrest him. And I'm like, this guy should be in school too. So why should we trust the government? Like, why should we trust like the institutions? Like, I have zero trust in the police. I have like absolutely no faith in the institution, regardless of whether it's here in Nova Scotia or in South Africa. Even the example of South Africa, for example, the police are majority black, but they perpetuated the Marikana massacre. So I have no faith in the institution of the police, no matter whether it's staffed by black people, whether it's staffed by white people. Whoever it's staffed by, the institution of police is anti-black, and it's a racist institution meant to harm black bodies. That's just a reality. Whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in the States, whether you are ASAP Rocky, wherever you are, you're going to be caged, you're going to be arrested. So my question is, why should we trust these reports? Why should we even care if the police commissioner or whoever comes and starts giving an apology? That apology is not worth anything. The next week they're tasing someone in the street. So why should I even care about such an apology? Or even believe anything that comes out of these institutions, which are inherently racist and a product of genocide?
Yeah. So, let's reflect on that. One, why? That's an excellent question. Why? Why should we trust the institutions that we're all working in and through and impacted by? And then I also want to, if I can further that, what do you think institutions or the government or various government bodies have to do to begin cultivating an atmosphere of trust?
I think that it's important for whoever I work with the government, to build that trust. And all I can offer is that I try to instill that with myself and my staff to build the trust. And it comes one conversation at a time. It comes one community meeting at a time. And then you don't necessarily dismiss that community, that conversation, you go back at it again. And at least the folks that I work with, we have a commitment that says, you don't work 9 to 5 as a government job with what we do. You work on weekends, you work after hours, because that's when the community is available. So the community groups that I work with, that becomes how I try to build their trust. And if I can build their trust, it does allow me to build a relationship. And if I can build that relationship, it allows me then to go to my colleagues in government to say, you need to sit down with this group or this individual to help resolve the problem. So if there's no reason for you to offer up the trust and you say, why should I would say it's up to the government institutions to earn your trust. And at some point in time, it may come about, but it may not because of various experiences that you may have. So I can only speak for the folks that I work with. And we work every day to try to not only build that trust, but also to keep it. And so the commitment even to this plan is I have to hold my colleagues accountable to what's written in that document, because that document to me is the truth that this office exists on.
Lindell or Crystal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No,
go.
you go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's important. There's two aspects to it. You know, one, you know, being government. The reason why I got involved was that lack of trust and the lack of feeling that the system was for me. And the other reason is because someone in this room sold me a lemon and told me that this work was more or was less than what it was.
True talk.
Yeah.
All the tea is being spilled right now.
Just kidding. No, really, I got involved because I felt the same way. Why is there a system who's making decisions, municipal government especially, every day on our citizens, and nobody that looks who is most affected by decisions are being part of those conversations. So, you know, there's the aspect of being at the table and want to make sure that you're part of that decision-making aspect, but then also we have to realize that governments weren't created to make everybody happy. They were created to keep people in power. And, you know, how do we break that? And I don't know if we can break that, but we can definitely address it and have more people who are inside, who feel the same way, who are going to think differently and think outside the box. I remember some of the first meetings I had with staff when we would have organized community meetings and saying, well, we should do it at a community center and offer someone from the community doing childcare. And that seemed to be like mind-blowing to be able to do something like that. But that is a barrier to folks who would need to be part of those discussions. And, you know, maybe one day we'll get there, but it's still mind-blowing to some people. But it is a necessity when you go in the community. So I hope that one, we get to a place where people can trust the government, but we should always be skeptical. If we're not skeptical, then we're really not paying attention to what's happening. And we shouldn't trust everything government says, because it's a small body of people making decisions, and there are more people who are not elected who need to be part of those decisions as well. So, you know, even if it's not trusting fully, it's also making sure that if you don't trust it, tell why. Why don't you trust it? Why don't you think this is working? So when action plans come out, that can be accounted for and that can be worked on.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I work for an organization that, where a group of the members are government employees, and so the services that they provide as recreation practitioners are to connect with their community. And I've only been with the organization a short time, but what I've noticed is that these particular individuals that I've had the pleasure of working with over these last few years have a strong desire to do better. And I think that that's at least a place to start, where they recognize that there's something wrong and that they've kind of contributed to there being something wrong, and now they want to change it. And so if there's a group of people out there that want to see something change, and even though they may come up, I guess, or at least have some level of resistance from their particular employers, I think that's a brave place to be able to say, you know what, this isn't right. It is not right for us to be providing recreation programs and not seeing folks of different ethnic identities or sexual orientation or whatever, being able to express themselves in those particular environments is as true as can be. And so I think building the capacity for them to be able to question policies, I think is important. It's not always the role of the person that has to make the decisions to do that. I think we need to empower folks on the ground level to do that.
You know, I just wanted to add, I think there's a way in which, you know, there's this system. There's a system of policing, there's a system of government, there's a system of education, there's a system of health. And so I think there's a way for us to engage those systems through a practice of harm reduction, right? I think there's a really political way of addressing the system, right? So you already know there's enough of the kind of data that we collect that we know that it's not simply going to the doctor's office, right? It's not simply going to get a prescription. It's not simply going to open a bank account. It's not simply going to go grocery shopping, right? These aren't the simple ways. They're not simple tasks. So if we think of it as harm reduction, what kind of strategies can we put into place to make those practices as minimize the harm that we will experience? Whilst, yes, I said whilst, on the other side, we start developing our own liberatory practices, right? And so there are folks who are like, there are white folks who will put their bodies on the line and be like, no, I'm going to intervene when I see somebody being questioned or surveilled for whatever reason, right? So how can we build liberatory alliances that allow us then to live more full lives? So there could be the harm reduction piece, because I don't see all y'all showing up at the provincial government or in Ottawa and demanding, you know, and tearing down the walls. Like I don't see us getting on the bus. I'm willing to go. I didn't say I wouldn't go. I just don't see all millions of us across the country going and demanding that kind of change. Many of us will say, no, we should vote. Okay, but is there a way that we can vote that's a practice of harm reduction, right? And so I think these are just some of the ways to think about that. And just another note, because I don't know if there's another question. So if we have a question, put your hand up, I'll stop talking. Oh, 2 questions, I'll stop talking. So can we get the 2 questions right now? If there's a third, yeah, well, I want both people to ask, and then we can answer what we can. So if there's a third question, no? So if both people can ask you questions, please make it brief, and then we can all participate in an answer.
Thank you very much. My name is Valentine Keng Beza. I'm a media practitioner, and my roots go as far back as Cameroon. So that in itself should tell you that I have a different perspective on what racism and colonization and the neo-colonization practice that is being upheld today in Africa. We see it here in Canada, blacks who are here, they've been fighting for so many things that when we come, we don't have an idea, we don't have a clue. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that so many of you have taken the lead to work and to work with government, and Lindell going close to government, be inside, and I'm sure the views he had when he was outside are probably different from what he has once he's inside. And he may even be having a backlash from his community. But my take is this: I feel that the structures that we're talking about here, be it the United Nations, tying it back to the decade of people of African descent, that structure, that institution wasn't built because Africans or black people were supposed to be a part of it. No, it was a matter of let's stop the war among ourselves. Let's never fight again. Because in 1885, when they decided in Berlin to go colonize Africa, there was no black person sitting there to make that decision. So bringing it back to why we want us in this room to understand the dynamics that racism, and there's something I call the theory of the PTSD in racism, right from the root in colonization. Yes. Because when you look at it, I feel that the oppression, the effects of slavery and colonization is actually kicking in. So we're feeling this rage because it's almost like a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder that's coming hundreds and hundreds of years after the act was already done. Yes. And that's why people say, but why are black people violent? Black people are not violent. They see a lot of things in your action within the system of government that you don't see. And is that effect? So my question would be, for all of us sitting here and looking at the system, we in Canada, we should ask ourselves, when they talk about the data, you go on the internet, you look at Statistics Canada, has a lot of stats about how many black people, how many this, how many that. If we look at those numbers and come here and say, okay, look at the prison system, why are so many black people in the prisons? You would say, okay, proportionate to the population of Nova Scotia, that doesn't make sense. But why is that so? And how can we reverse the trend? But you go back into the schools and you say, oh, there are programs, there's scholarships, but we don't even have African Nova Scotians applying for these programs. Why? But oh, think about it. They were not able to go to high school. Why weren't they able to go to high school? Oh, dad was in jail while mom was struggling to take care of this kid on her own. So you see where the problem, it starts from there and it goes so far. So if you tackle the problem at the end, you can't get a solution. But if you go back to the base, to the source, where the individual, the newborn, the baby, how the family structure is held together, then you can see further. So my question would be for us to think about how the data that we have about the empowerment of black people, whether it's in black business, whether they own business to generate wealth, because the economics of it is very important. Without money, without resources, you can't really change so much in society. People will always change it for you. And also the aspect of telling your story with your own voice, documenting and having a lot of positive media to be showcased so everybody can see, not just within the 28 days or 29 days of February, but to be able to see year-long the contributions of black people. Kids can understand that, and the government can see reasons to realize that the system wasn't built for us, but now we have to cohabit.
Yes.
Do we tear the system down and build a new one, or do we include black people in everything we do? Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to give Her Honor a moment to finish with the question. So thank you for your patience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The whole matter is very complex, and I have a lot to say, but I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to make a comment and then ask a particular question, and it has to do with the Count Us In plan. And I'm very strong on responsibility and accountability. Both are important. And I see that the implementation of this plan is the responsibility of the Committee of Deputy Ministers for African Nova Scotian issues dealing with this plan. So my question is, number one, what's the makeup of the Deputy Ministers Committee? Is it a diverse committee, or is it just one group of deputy ministers, number one? Number two, how will these deputy ministers be held accountable? Number three, did the deputy ministers submit a strategy for implementing this, this plan? Are there goals? How will they measure success with regards to this plan? And remember, African Nova Scotian Affairs has been in place since 2004, and we are now 16 years later, basically still talking about similar things. So I still want to know how these deputy ministers will be held accountable, and what is their plan to ensure that this works, because the decade for African Canadians will be ending real soon. Yeah. Does that mean this ends too?
So thank you so much. We're over time, but I just want to give Wayn an opportunity to respond. Is that okay? Yeah. And then I'll wrap up and we can thank all the panelists. Are you with me? Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So the deputy committee is made up of those that are on the economic table and on the social table. So it's justice, education, health, community services, labor and advanced education. And there was an agreement that they would devise, according to what we have as a document, a series of indices that they're going to try to help to monitor. Underneath that is a relationship that we're trying to build with the African Nova Scotia community, first with some of the organizations that already exist, to allow there to be that table to talk about what does this look like in terms of a particular outcome, not from government point of view, but from a community point of view. So those particular conversations are about to start so that we could have probably 5 or 6 different sector tables that will be sitting discussing what was in this either under justice, recognition, or development. So take, for example, if we think about the one for recognition, the thought is to bring any of the conversations that we want to have with the community under the umbrella of the Black Culture Center, the Africville Heritage Trust Museum, the Black Willis Heritage Society, UNIA up in Glace Bay, to try to have a conversation around how does these things become meaningful and how will we track it. The level of accountability that we would like to put in place is to roll that into their mandate letters. As the ministers have mandate letters as to what's expected of them, we've been given a signal that in the new system that we're going to have for the deputies that sit with this issue table, that will be rolled up into their mandates. So the only accountability that I think will be strong enough is when the community sees some of these actions and say, that's not good enough. The only accountability that I can say what we will hold them accountable to is that we didn't get a passing grade. With regards to how often that deputy committee meets, it's once every 2 months. Underneath the deputies, there's a senior table that are made up of officials that are usually executive directors from those different government departments. And our first call was to ask, what are the activities that you have across government that touch on African Nova Scotians? And there's about 186. But those are not integrated into a plan, a comprehensive plan, nor does each one of those activities have a line item attached to money, a line item attached to the outcome. That's going to be the work that we're going to be doing in the next 3 or 4 months. The thinking about where the decade is, the fact that it's ending, is not necessarily our thinking. Our thinking is to ingrain what we're trying to do, and like I told you, 10,000 civil servants have to also own this plan. All the 50-plus African Nova Scotia communities have to find a way into this plan, and then the general public has to find the way into this plan. So we're, in my opinion, at the very beginning of something that nobody else has even tried or imagined. So it's a huge challenge. It's a huge opportunity for people to say, it ain't going to work. But it's also a huge challenge for us to use our imaginations to say, no, we can make it work. And so the staff that I work with, the other departments that I work with, we know that it's going to be all eyes on us. There's no other jurisdiction that's taken the UN document and done anything. Even the provincial government reached out to Ottawa, and all we heard was that there's going to be an envelope for anti-racism strategy, and there's another envelope around maybe mental health or activities as a race and social development. So you imagine what is like in other provinces that have African Canadian populations, and they probably are wondering, what is my province doing? So we're trying to hold ourselves way above the stratosphere to take this on, because it is a big challenge. And with regards to how long we're going to stay with it, I'm not imagining 2025 it's done. What I'm imagining is that this will continue to go. And what the United Nations Human Rights Commission are trying to do is to embed this notion of having an opportunity to actually build a secretariat around people of African descent. So there already has been talk about not allowing this to fall down after 2025, but rather to keep it to continue. And we need to hold the government of Canada accountable because they are a signatory to this document. Now, whether or not the province gets a passing grade or a failing grade is going to be on how we are able, in my opinion, to bring all those parties together. And if we are successful, then my hope is that this province will be able to say, yeah, we've tried to turn the corner on transforming this system, because it's not about protecting the policies and procedures, but it's about building new relationships, and that will take time.
Are any of the deputy ministers Black?
There's no deputy ministers in the provincial government structure. They don't exist.
Deputy ministers don't exist?
No, there's no Black deputy minister.
Oh, that's the question I asked.
Yeah,
Okay,
there's
so
none.
Okay.
Yeah.
And of course, we have so much more to talk about, but apparently they're not pulling in a table and food where we can actually sit and tuck in. They're not rolling in a piano, so we can, they're just not doing that. So I've only been at DAL since the 1st of May, 2019, and this is my first experience here with the Institute. So I'm hoping that the Institute has at least, I don't know, 12 more focus sections just in this year on blackness, black radicalism, black politics, black policy, black health policy. You kind of get where I'm going with that. And so I want to also take this time, I know Tari's going to do this, but I want to thank the panelists. It was great being able just to hang out with you guys while you were like dropping all this like dope knowledge and telling us ish. It was great. And I also want to big up Tari and Keisha. I don't know if you know them, but they are like OG academics. They are the ones that we should be we continue to put our energy behind because their work is transformational. So thank you, Tari and Keisha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have final things? Yeah?
Thanks, everybody. I just want to say